So I want you to picture a tiny flake of limestone in the Mediterranean Sea, Lampedusa.
Race.
It's an Italian island, but it's actually closer to Africa than it is to Europe. And for most of history, it was just, a dot on the map.
Yeah, barely noticed.
Exactly. But today, if you look at Lampedusa, you are looking at one of the most profound and honestly uncomfortable symbols of our modern world.
It really is.
So today, we are doing a deep dive into this, tracing those rubber rafts backwards. We're opening up a pretty heavy stack of geopolitical research, specifically looking at the frameworks of Boris Kriger and the mid-century psychiatrist Frantz Fanon.
Yeah, two very intense thinkers.
Oh, for sure. And our mission here is to uncover the invisible architecture that actually built those rafts. We're following this very specific, tragic journey in reverse.
Right, what's often referred to in these notes as the reverse voyage. Because if you think about it, for centuries, the Mediterranean Sea carried traffic almost exclusively in one direction, right?
Yeah,
South.
ships heading down.
Exactly. It carried the galleons and steamers of conquerors, administrators, and soldiers from Europe down into Africa and beyond. But today, if you laid a transparent map of those old imperial sea lanes over a map of today's modern migrant routes, you'd see the exact same lines.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they were just running in the exact opposite direction.
So instead of heavily armed ships heading south, you have inflatable rubber rafts heading north. And they're carrying the descendants of the very people those empires went to rule.
Precisely.
And we aren't going to talk about this using the sterile language of the evening news. Talking about border quotas or processing centers.
Right. We're skipping the typical talking points.
We are bypassing all that noise to look at the historical and psychological machinery that makes those dangerous crossings happen.
Because it is crucial to understand that those rafts are not just some random tragedy, and they aren't just a spontaneous reaction to poverty either. According to the research we are unpacking today, they're actually a calculated verdict on a completely broken global promise. I mean, people don't risk their lives on unseaworthy dinghies on a whim.
No, of course not.
They do it when the brutal calculation of staying becomes demonstrably more dangerous than, facing the open sea. And to understand that specific calculation, we have to look at the exact historical moment the world was told that the era of domination was officially over.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we have to take ourselves back to the mid-20th century, the grand era of decolonization.
Right, the midnight ceremonies.
Yeah, across the world, you had these incredibly moving, highly publicized ceremonies. The colonial flag is lowered, a brand new national flag goes up, a new anthem is played over the radio.
Grown men and women weeping in the streets.
Exactly. The population is told, the foreigner is leaving, the land is finally yours, you are free. But Kriger's framework asks a really devastating question about that exact moment. What if that independence was actually a grand illusion?
Yeah, Kriger refers to this specific phenomenon as the Bluff of Decolonization.
The bluff.
Right. The idea here is that the midnight ceremony performed all the outward theatrical gestures of liberation, but the actual structural substance of freedom it never arrived.
So it was all for show.
Essentially, yes. The literal machinery of economic and political domination was left completely intact. The colonizers simply swapped out the visible symbols of power, but they retained all the invisible levers.
Right, the invisible chains. And I want to talk about the physical infrastructure because the notes give a great visual for how this worked. Think about the colonial railways.
Oh, the railways are the perfect example.
Right. When the empires built railways in their colonies, they didn't build them to connect local communities to each other. Yeah. They didn't build a transit network to foster domestic trade or help everyday citizens travel.
No, not at all.
They built them in rigid, straight lines from the extraction points like the copper mines, the rubber plantations, the cash crop farms, directly to the shipping ports.
Yeah, that is the perfect physical metaphor for those invisible chains Kriger describes. Those railways were engineered purely to drain the country's wealth outward.
Just extracting it all.
Exactly. And the fundamental reality is that the morning after those midnight independence ceremonies, those railways didn't magically change direction.
Right. They were still pointing to the ports.
Yeah. The extractive economy remained exactly as it was. The new nations were immediately trapped in structural domination. I mean, their economies were entirely based on exporting raw, unrefined materials at prices dictated by the former colonizers.
And then importing expensive manufactured goods from those same colonizers.
Exactly. The banking systems, the reliance on foreign capital, the unequal trade agreements, they all stayed completely in place.
It's basically like, think of a predatory multinational corporation taking over your town. They run the factory, they pollute the water, they underpay everyone. Then, after years of massive protests, they finally agree to leave. But all they actually do is change their corporate logo on the building, appoint a local person as the new CEO, and just keep the exact same exploitative business model running.
That's a really good analogy.
Which logically leads us to the next big question. If the old bosses physically sailed away back to Europe, who was actually running this inherited machine on the ground?
This is exactly where the analysis of Frantz Fanon becomes so vital. Fanon was a psychiatrist from Martinique, and he became a leading intellectual voice in the Algerian struggle for independence back in the 1950s.
And Fanon had this terrifying foresight, right?
Oh, absolutely. Even before many nations had officially won their independence, he prophesied exactly who would take the keys to the state apparatus. He identified a group he called the national bourgeoisie, or the comprador elite.
A sort of parasitic middleman class.
That is precisely how Fanon viewed them. I mean, these were not the farmers or the workers who fought the hardest for independence.
Right, the people actually on the ground.
Right. They were the educated professional class that had been formed entirely under colonialism. They were the bureaucrats, the merchants, the clerks that tried to interface with the imperial system.
So when the colonial governors packed up and vacated their grand villas, this comprador elite simply moved their own suitcases in.
Exactly. They treated national independence not as a collective victory, but as their own private property.
So instead of dismantling that extractive machine, instead of tearing up those railways and building a self-sustaining nation that actually serves its citizens, they just position themselves as the new toll collectors.
Yes.
They become the brokers between global capital and their own oppressed populations.
Exactly. And they enforce this new arrangement using the exact same tools of violence. Fanon's framework introduces this haunting concept of the torturer who was once tortured.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you have a former freedom fighter, someone who might have literally been beaten in a colonial prison, who now sits behind the exact same colonial desk.
And doing the same things.
Yep. He is using the exact same colonial prisons, the exact same surveillance laws, and the exact same violent police techniques against his own people, just to maintain his new grip on power.
So what does this all mean? Because I have to bring up a section in these notes called the paradox of the restraining hand. And I genuinely struggle with this concept. It suggests that the new domestic rulers were somehow worse than the colonizers. Wait, this paradox of the restraining hand almost makes it sound like these notes are arguing classical colonialism was, like, preferable.
I know, it sounds jarring.
Yeah, I have a hard time wrapping my head around that without it sounding like a historical endorsement of empire. Like we were taking a pro-colonialism side here, which we definitely aren't.
No, definitely not. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is crucial to understand that Kriger is absolutely not endorsing colonialism. The text makes it clear that classical colonizers operated as brutal predators.
Okay, good.
However, his argument is about the actual mechanics of exploitation. Because the classical empire wanted to continuously extract wealth from the colony over decades or even centuries, they had a cynical economic need to keep the host alive.
Right.
They needed the population healthy enough to work the fields and the mines. Therefore, the colonizers were somewhat constrained by their own bureaucratic procedures and their long-term need for a reliable labor force.
I see. So they were a parasite, but like a parasite that didn't want to accidentally kill their host, because then the free lunch ends.
Exactly. But Kriger argues that the new comprador elites often lacked even those cynical long-term constraints.
Because they were just looting.
Right. Because their position was often highly unstable, they focused on short-term looting. They plundered the state treasury into the ground, siphoned off the foreign aid, and stashed the wealth in offshore bank accounts in Switzerland or London.
So it was just a smash and grab.
Basically. The removal of the colonizer didn't result in liberation. According to this analysis, it resulted in a terrifying vacuum of restraint. The argument is an indictment of the fake decolonization that left populations entirely exposed to unconstrained domestic predators.
But how does an entire society just accept that? I mean, how do millions of people watch their liberators become their new oppressors, watch the treasury get looted, and not just tear the whole system down immediately?
That is the big question.
Right. And to answer that, the notes suggest we have to look inward at the deep psychological scars left behind. And this makes sense, given Fanon wasn't just a revolutionary. His primary training was as a psychiatrist.
And his most profound psychological diagnosis was the colonization of the mind.
Right.
Fanon argued that colonialism was never just about soldiers physically occupying a piece of territory. It was about the installation of what he called the master's gaze inside the minds of the colonized population.
The master's gaze.
Yes. It's a deeply insidious process where you learn to see yourself, your skin color, your traditions, and your entire culture through the eyes of an occupier who has already judged you as fundamentally inferior.
Here's where it gets really interesting and honestly pretty heartbreaking. The concept of the borrowed tongue.
Yes, the language aspect.
This explores the very real dynamic where a mother realizes that the only way her child will survive, the only way they will get a job in the new bureaucracy or avoid the harshest poverty, is by mastering the colonizer's language.
Exactly.
So she deliberately teaches her child the imperial tongue instead of her own native language. But in doing so, she is quietly severing their ancestral memory. Because a language isn't just words, it contains an entire worldview. Right?
It's a level.
A way of resolving disputes, a connection to the past. She's essentially teaching her child to leave her behind in order to survive.
It is a profound form of invisible coercion. The colonizer's language becomes the official language of power, of the court system, of the universities, of upward mobility. Meanwhile, the native tongue is systematically reduced to a charming but completely useless relic.
Wow.
Fanon observed that this fractures the colonized subject's psyche. They're forced to continually perform an imitation of the colonizer, chasing a standard of European acceptance that is constantly moving further away. They are alienated from their own roots, but never fully accepted by the imperial center.
And Fanon points out another psychological trap here, the prison of historical roles.
Right.
It's the trap of defining yourself entirely by your opposition to the colonizer. I like to think of it almost like a teenager who rebels by doing the exact opposite of whatever their parents want.
That's a great way to look at it.
On the surface, it looks like rebellion. But the parents are still secretly controlling all of the teenager's choices because the teenager is entirely defined by the reaction to them. If your whole national identity is built simply on, we are the ones who resist the empire, who are you when the empire officially lowers its flag and goes home? How do you escape an identity built entirely on opposition?
This is exactly what the philosopher Gilles Deleuze wrestled with, and his concepts actually provide a fascinating lens for this specific problem. Deleuze argued that true freedom isn't found by taking a fixed identity and just fighting another fixed identity. He used this brilliant structural metaphor, a tree versus a rhizome.
A rhizome.
Right, like a root system. So a tree is deeply hierarchical. It has a single central root system, a massive trunk, and branches that extend outward. That is the classic colonial structure, or even the structure of the new comprador state.
Top-down, rigid, centralized. You cut off a head, and you can replace it, but the whole tree structure remains.
Exactly. But a rhizome, if you think of a ginger root or an underground fungal network, it operates completely differently. It's fluid. It spreads horizontally.
Okay, I picture that.
It has no single center, no trunk to chop down. Deleuze suggests that to escape the psychological trap, the self should become an assemblage, a fluid self that is continually evolving.
It's adapting.
Right. To escape the prison of historical roles, you can't just invert the colonial hierarchy and put yourself at the top of the tree. You have to abandon the concept of the tree entirely. You take what he calls a line of flight and create a decentralized, horizontal identity that breaks free from the colonizer's framing altogether.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But to understand just how deeply that psychological trap of the master's gaze was set in the first place, we have to look at the massive historical lie that justified the whole operation.
Oh, the civilizing alibi.
Yes. The colonizers didn't just show up with gunboats and say, hey, we're here to steal your resources and plunge you into poverty.
Well, yeah.
They cloaked the entire enterprise in what Kriger calls the civilizing alibi.
Yeah, and this relied heavily on the myth of the savage. The European imagination of the 18th and 19th centuries created a very convenient fiction. They painted a picture of backwards, chaotic native populations that desperately required the firm, enlightened hand of the empire to bring them out of darkness and into modernity.
But the research points out that the pre-colonial reality was vastly different. These continents weren't blank slates of chaos.
No, not at all.
They had vast, complex interregional trade networks. They had sophisticated dispute resolution systems and political councils that operated on consensus rather than, top-down decree.
They were highly organized.
Right. The colonizers deliberately shattered those traditional systems of conflict resolution because they needed to impose their own centralized hierarchy.
Exactly.
And then, when tensions inevitably boiled over because the social fabric was completely destroyed, the colonial administrators pointed at the resulting violence and said, look at these ancient tribal hatreds. See? They are savages. They need us to keep the peace.
It was a meticulously engineered self-fulfilling prophecy, literally designed to launder their own atrocities. Kriger's analysis contrasts the high-minded diaries of the missionaries, men who often sincerely believed they were bringing spiritual light to darkness, with the absolute bureaucratic horror of systems like King Leopold's Congo.
Oh, the contrast is just staggering.
It really is.
And we have to talk about Leopold's ledger, because it lays bare the absolute hypocrisy of the civilizing alibi. To ensure that his mercenary soldiers weren't wasting expensive imported bullets on hunting animals, the Belgian colonial administrators required strict proof.
Proof of where the bullets went.
Right, proof that every single bullet issued had been used to kill a human being who was resisting the forced extraction of rubber. And the physical proof they demanded was a severed hand.
It's just horrifying.
So you literally had clerks sitting in offices counting severed hands like they were receipts in an accounting ledger.
It reveals that the civilizing mission was merely an alibi for industrial-scale barbarism. I mean, the greater savagery didn't exist in the jungle. It wore the starched uniform of civilization, sat at a desk, and kept very careful accounting of its brutality.
But wait, I want to push back on this geographical framing just a bit, because the source material brings up a fascinating counterpoint here. You could easily argue that empires treated people terribly everywhere, and the text points out that the empires did this to their own people too.
Yes, the colonies across the street.
Exactly, the colonies across the street.
That is a vital piece of the puzzle. If you examine the industrial slums of 19th century Europe, places like Victorian London or the manufacturing hubs of Belgium, the factory workers and coal miners were treated with a startlingly similar logic.
They were completely disposable.
Yeah. They were squeezed into cramped, disease-ridden quarters, worked to the point of literal exhaustion, and managed strictly as a disposable resource.
So the geography of contempt didn't actually stop at the water's edge. The empire was essentially an engine of domination that ran on the same exact fuel, whether it was operating in a rubber plantation in the Congo or a textile mill in Manchester.
That's entirely accurate.
It was fundamentally about treating human beings as abstract units of labor. But this logic of treating humans as labor units relied on one crucial dependency. The system actually needs your labor.
Right.
So what happens when the global economy evolved and suddenly doesn't need those workers anymore?
This raises an incredibly important question, and it is where Kriger's framework takes us right into the modern era. He describes a shift toward the neopolitics of controlled chaos.
Controlled chaos.
Yes. In the era of classical colonialism, as we discussed, a human being was reduced to a resource. That is a deeply degraded condition, obviously. But a resource is still something the system inherently values.
Because they need you.
Right. The colonizer needed the population alive to harvest the cotton or mine the silver.
Right, they needed you to keep the machine running.
But modern global extractors operate under a completely different calculus. They don't want the burden of governing. They don't want to invest in building railways, paving roads, or maintaining a functional civil society.
They're too expensive.
Exactly. Today, if a multinational corporation wants access to rare earth minerals or oil, it is often cheaper and vastly more profitable to let a fragile state shatter completely.
Just let it collapse.
Yeah, they let it collapse into a fragmented war of all against all, fund a local warlord to secure that single specific mine, extract the valuable resources, and simply ignore the surrounding wreckage.
So trace that ultimate demotion of humanity for us, because the notes outline a terrifying three-step descent.
The descent goes exactly like this. First, under classical colonialism, you are viewed as a resource. You are brutally exploited, but the system keeps you alive because it requires your muscle.
Step 1, resource.
Then, as the global economy shifts to highly mechanized extraction and the neopolitics of controlled chaos takes over, you are no longer needed for labor. Your state is shattered, your economy is ruined, and you become ballast.
Ballast. Like deadweight.
Exactly. You are viewed as useless deadweight to be thrown overboard by the global economy.
So if they aren't even valued as ballast anymore, that only leaves one option. The system shifts from ignoring them to actively repelling them.
Precisely. Finally, step 3. As you flee the unlivable wreckage of your home and seek safety, you are transformed into a destabilizing force.
Wow.
You arrive at the heavily fortified borders of the wealthy nations, and you are viewed not as a human being, not even as ballast, but as an active, hostile threat to be repelled with tear gas and patrol boats.
And that brings us full circle. If we look back to where we started this entire conversation, to the tiny limestone island of Lampedusa and those rubber rafts crossing the Mediterranean, who is actually on those rafts?
It's the ballast.
Right. The people on those rafts aren't just spontaneously deciding to seek better weather. They are fleeing a global system that systematically hollowed out their countries, installed comprador elites who looted the treasuries, and then utilized controlled chaos to shatter the remaining state structures for profit. Classical colonialism needed you alive to exploit you. Controlled chaos just wants you gone.
According to this framework, the people on those rafts are the physical, living evidence of the Bluff of Decolonization. They are the human cost of a global system that enthusiastically changed its flags but quietly maintained its invisible chains.
So why does all this matter to you, listening right now? We've traced this reverse voyage all the way back. We've looked at the shattered states, the comprador elites stealing the keys, the psychological scars of the borrowed tongue, and those midnight ceremonies that promised a freedom that never actually arrived.
There's a lot to take in.
It is. But it matters because this grammar of empire isn't just an abstract history lesson confined to the 20th century. It is the invisible architecture that is shaping our global economy today. It dictates the violent conditions where the rare earth minerals for our smartphones come from. It dictates how crushing international debt is structured. And it is the direct, systemic cause of the border crisis headlines you read every single day.
And, stepping back from the immediate geopolitical crisis, this framework leaves us with a profound, almost unsettling thought to explore regarding our own future.
Oh, absolutely.
We talked earlier about those invisible chains, the railways, the trade deficits, the master's gaze that forces you to internalize your own inferiority.
Right, the mechanisms of control that don't require physical soldiers.
Exactly. If we look at the trajectory of the 21st century, we have to ask, what are the new invisible chains? We are currently building a world governed by algorithms, artificial intelligence, and unprecedented digital surveillance.
Digital colonialism.
Basically, yeah. Data is often called the new oil, and the extraction of our personal data, our habits, our movements, our desires, is increasingly dominated by a handful of centralized, borderless tech monopolies.
So the Rhizome Deleuze talked about the tech companies became the fluid network.
Precisely. If the master's gaze was once the watchful eye of the colonial administrator, is the new master's gaze the algorithm in our pockets, constantly observing, categorizing, and subtly manipulating our behavior to serve distant centers of capital.
That is chilling.
If the mechanics of abstraction have merely evolved into the digital realm, we might find that the bluff of liberation is a cycle we are all destined to repeat unless we learn to recognize the chains we cannot see.